UFC used to be an illegal sport, and supporting it was career suicide. This is why the only people that were really willing to invest on it full on were nobodies. Dana White, the Fertitta brothers. These were people that didn't have anything to fear about their image. But the little people that decided to take the risk and maybe take career suicide by supporting the UFC rarely ever get recognition. And you'd be surprised how big some of these names are. This is a complete 180 from right now. Nowadays, it's super common for UFC to influence the training of movie stars and super famous people to practice MMA. But at the very early ages, one of the first proponents of it was Al Bundy, also known as Ed O'Neill. I prefer to call him Sofia Vergara's boyfriend in Modern Family. Maybe it's just Hispanic. Al Bundy's actually a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. And he even attributes this as one of the biggest achievements he's ever had in his life. After his kids, but he has to say that or Sofia Vergara is gonna get mad. So it's definitely a black belt. He was promoting MMA out here when, like I said, it was super unsafe and maybe even career suicide to promote MMA. In 2002, he did a piece about the sport, and you got the usual old heads saying that it was human cockfighting and all these things were crazy, and essentially it was discussing whether the UFC was real or if it was fake and how barbaric it was for being real. And one of the only people defending the sport was Ed O'Neill, swearing by it. And he's passionate about it. He'll go head to head with Dana White and tell him that he's messing up.
Take a guy like John Jones and you'll say, he could probably beat heavyweights. I don't think he could beat Dos Santos.
What makes him so relevant is the fact that this time, he is basically the proto-ambassador of the sport. There's nobody else supporting the sport, really. And Ed O'Neill was out there vouching for it when he had a full-blown acting career in place. Keep in mind, he was not a UFC investor. He just respected the sport and thought it was great. Some people that did contribute a lot, though, were the 23 investors. And who are these investors, you might ask? Well, they're essentially believers of the UFC. They had a chance to buy a percentage of it through their either buddy or investor, Ari Emanuel. And I'm sure they're fight fans, because if not, I don't think they would have put the $250K that it takes to invest in this. But it is quite a group of celebrities. Marky Mark, Sylvester Stallone, Tom Brady, even the whole team of the Patriots, Batman, Rocky Balboa. Oh, I already said Rocky. The mayor of Flavortown, among many others. It's basically a who's who of people that have plenty of money and believe in the sport somewhat. And even somebody has had some classic UFC interviews like Conan O'Brien. And in terms of the investment, Dana White mentioned that the investment was supposed to get back to them, but the time was not really disclosed, and I don't think it was all of them either. So all that is still kind of muggy, and it's because it's not information that it's officially out there yet, and probably will never be out there. What I will say is some of them definitely invested a lot heavier in the promotion. Mark Wahlberg allegedly has invested $40 million into the UFC/Endeavor. Which, when you think about it, it's an absolutely wild number, because that's how much money it took the Fertittas to keep the company alive before they went into the Ultimate Fighter, and that did a complete 180 on the UFC. And we got Paul Brandt, or Kevin James. He has done so much for the UFC and trying to put him in the mainstream light. In an episode of King of Queens, he brought Rampage Jackson, Randy Couture, Dan Henderson, Fran Trigg. This is when the UFC was getting certified as legitimate badasses, but it was still very niche of a product. And to be honest, in my opinion, Here Comes the Boom is the best MMA movie out there. I have not watched Warriors, and I've heard that Warriors is awesome, so that's on me. But Here Comes the Boom is a classic film. And the fact that he gave a role to my boy Bas Rutten is insane. And just to his contribution to putting the UFC mainstream, he deserves this mention. Another person that has made contributions, and this time, not by making it mainstream, but actually collaborating with the UFC, is Mark Zuckerberg. And no, when I say collaborate, I don't mean him just buying the entire UFC card and just being the only person sitting right there next to Dana White. That's not really what I mean, even though I'm sure during COVID, Dana absolutely loved that money. I'm more talking about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook specifically partnering with the UFC to broadcast shows on Facebook Live. In fact, they streamed Fight Night 23 and the prelims of UFC 131 on Facebook Live. And this happened in 2011. That can put into perspective how massive this was in the moment. Because even though the UFC didn't stick with Facebook Live, streaming platforms would become a huge thing in the business. And who knows, maybe the ESPN Plus deal would have never taken place if the UFC hadn't tested the waters with Facebook Live first. And now the Zuckerberg and the UFC are partnered again, trying to put a metaverse in the UFC in the metaverse or something, where you can apparently be in the cage or you can get a referee cam. Now, whether this is just as successful as streaming pay-per-views, I will not comment on that. But someone that actually provided the UFC with an extremely successful formula that would catapult them into success is Mark Burnett. And you might be saying, who the hell is Mark Burnett? And you might not know him by his name. That's fair. But you definitely have seen his work. He has produced over 900 ultra popular reality TV shows. And the one that you will for sure know him for is from The Ultimate Fighter. Well, I bet you've heard of the show The Apprentice. I bet you've heard of Shark Tank. I bet you've heard of The Voice. I bet you've heard of The Contender. And hell, maybe even The Contender series. And since this is a channel for MMA fans, you might also know him from Bully Beatdown, a TV show that aired on MTV, and I will say this is the TV show that brought me in as an MMA fan. Once again, it's putting it in the limelight, it's putting the sport out there, and a channel as famous as MTV just made it so mainstream, and it brought a bunch of random fans. I watched this show when I was probably around 11, 12 years old, and I'm still a fan to this day. And I watch every single pay-per-view. And you can multiply me by millions of other people. So safe to say, big contribution on this end. But that's not even with Mark Burnett. He's also a big investor and the executive producer of the PFL. And then he would help in the deal with getting ESPN on board. But from somebody that likes to stay in the shadows to somebody that it's literally the boys of the UFC, Ron Perlman. You might know him from Sons of Anarchy or Hellboy, or you might know him as the Beast from Beauty and the Beast. Ron Perlman has literally become the voice of the UFC. And why did he get the role is not really clear, super random. Dana was probably a big fan of Sons of Anarchy, and Ron Perlman was a big fan of the UFC, so Dana was like, all right, come in. So that's probably how it happened, but every time you hear a voiceover in the UFC, it's probably Ron Perlman. So he deserves a mention here as well. But from somebody that you might not really know to somebody you definitely know because he's the biggest star in the world, arguably, that would be Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson has contributed so much to the UFC. Have you seen his shoes?
These shoes fucking suck. Fuck these shoes.
Well, maybe not the shoes. But the biggest star in the world, though, has presented the BMF belt to Jorge Masvidal and is now having a production completely based around Mark Hurd in the Smashing Machine movie. But more than the shoes and the movie and everything, The Rock sits on the chair of TKO Holdings, the company that owns the UFC and the WWE, blending both worlds in together perfectly. So The Rock is literally the boss of Dana White and everybody else. So whatever The Rock wants to do with the UFC, he can do. The other 6 people on the board agree, but he still can do. From the most well-known person in the world and also one of the most powerful people in the world to, honestly, probably the most powerful person in the world, at least at one point. Donald Trump came in and saved the UFC when they were needing it the most. Nobody would be able to give the UFC a venue because they didn't want to watch that human cockfighting happen in their arena. And the one person that decided to lend their venue to the UFC was Donald Trump. So literally without Donald Trump, C5 doesn't happen, meaning that UFC 300 is not gonna happen either. So the UFC would literally be dead without Donald Trump. A massive influence and something that Dana White has never forgotten himself. In fact, to this day, Donald Trump gets a special entrance every single time he's at a UFC show. And from one billionaire to another, Mark Cuban had a massive contribution to the world of MMA. Nowadays, if you want to watch any upcoming stars, you go to UFC Fight Pass, no doubt. But back when the sport was starting, if you wanted to become a hardcore UFC fan, which was extremely hard to do, would only be facilitated by Mark Cuban, because he was the owner of HDNet, also known as Access TV now. a channel that was founded by Mark Cuban. On his website, broadcast.com, sold for $6 billion, making Mark Cuban a very rich person. HDNet started in 2007, and it would broadcast basically all the new upcoming fights that weren't the UFC. And all of this was Mark Cuban's idea, giving MMA fans that were fans of the UFC or a bully beatdown, and being able to transform them into hardcore fans that could always watch content. In addition to this, Inside the MMA was a vital news and interview resource that nobody else was providing at the time, before the era of social media. And he even tried to put a fight between Fedor Emelianenko and Randy Couture for HDNet, but the fight just never happened. But that would have been huge. And Donald Trump and Mark Cuban were both investors in Affliction, which was a failed company. But now from somebody that was trying to make the UFC bigger to somebody that literally built the UFC in John Milius. Now you might not know who John Milius is. And personally, I didn't know of him before I started researching this video. Well, he's a cartoon of a human being who wrote Conan the Barbarian, among other things. He was a student of Rorion Gracie, and he had a wild mind, which was exactly what the UFC was looking for at the time. He was the proponent of the idea to put alligators around the arc. And Art Davie, Rorion Gracie, and John Milius would be the three key components that would start the UFC. And his specific focus was finding investors. And like I said, he also provided ideas here and there. For example, put alligators around the UFC cage but that obviously never happened. However, one thing that did stick, and now is the UFC's almost entire brand, is the Octagon. And without his name in Hollywood, Royce Gracie would have never gotten the idea on his head as a possibility of a venture, which means that UFC 1 would have never happened. So this definitely makes John Milius the most vital person to founding the UFC. And the UFC would subsequently go on to build basically the entire city of Las Vegas. So if you want to watch that video on how they did it, check out that video right there. And if you want to check out the GOAT that was never recognized, you can check out that video right there. And I'll see you in those videos. See ya!
Ballin' now, skirt down, all of these diamonds so bottom for me with the yours now. You could drink it but take it slow. Ballin' for you, falling for